Welcome to After School Special. This is the first year that we're doing an alumni film and animation festival here at SVA. I am the chairman and founder of the social documentary department here at SVA, and I'm really proud and thrilled to have tonight one of our students from Group 1, the first year, our inaugural year, Mark Kendall, with his film La Camioneta. Mark was part of our very first class, and we're now 6 classes in the master's program in documentary. We started in 2009, and we have been extremely proud and happy tonight for Mark to represent the success of many, many of our students. And Mark was rather an unusual and hardworking individual from the moment that he started school. His very first film from his classwork in the first semester at school was nominated for a Student Academy Award, and he took that short film called Time Machine to festival after festival after festival and continued to do very well in all of his work and studies during his 2-year program with us. So when we talked about which films we thought we should bring and which students we thought we should bring back for this first festival, Mark was very, was one of the very first names that all came to our heads. But we hope you're really going to enjoy not only this film, but a lot of the other films that we're going to be showing throughout the weekend. And we couldn't be more proud of our students and happy to share their work with the rest of the world. This film has gone to numerous festivals, and you'll learn more about it after the film. Mark is here, and we'll be doing a Q&A with one of our present students, Daniela Torre. And please stay and talk to him about this film and enjoy it. Turn off your cell phones, and don't forget, if you want to talk about the festival, to hashtag After School Special for Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, and come back to tonight's midnight screening of Beavis and Butthead Do America. Well, which is so much like this film. It's a perfect double feature. So sit back, enjoy La Camioneta, and then enjoy a wonderful conversation between 2 SVA alumni colleagues. Thanks.
So as Mauro said, I'm going to be your moderator for this evening, and I'm going to introduce Mark. Mark Kendall's directing credits include the Student Academy Award nominated short The Time Machine and La Camioneta, which resulted in Variety citing him as a name to watch. His work has screened at the National Gallery of Art, the Jean Siskel Film Center, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and film festivals such as South by Southwest, Los Angeles, and Havana Film Festival. He's a Guggenheim Sundance Institute and IFP Film Society of Lincoln Center Emerging Visions Fellow. He earned a BA in Anthropology and a MA in Latin American Studies from Vanderbilt University, and he is a graduate student of SVA MFA Social Documentary Program. He currently lives and works in Philadelphia. Please welcome Mark Kendall. Mark, I think part of what's interesting about Q&As, and you've done many by now because this film has been touring for 2.5 years, which is amazing. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So I guess one of the interesting things about having Q&As with directors after the screenings is that you have access to the process, which is something that you never have access to while you see the film, because when you see a finished film, everything seems so seamless. The cuts, everything just kind of like flows as if it was the easiest thing. And I guess I'd like to start with You know, what was the first thing that you shot, and how much of the story and the whole thing that was happening in Guatemala City you knew about when you had the idea, when you first sort of approached this idea?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it started by making a trip to the auction, sort of as I was ending the year of my first. As I was nearing the end of my first year in the program, we were all asked to select a couple thesis ideas, and this was one idea that I had at the time. It was not the leading idea. I was sort of thinking I was going to stay in New York and develop a longer project out of the short that I had done the first year, which I sort of had ideas about how it could be expanded into a longer piece. And, you know, I felt like I had gotten some feedback from some friends and from a few of the professors that were sort of suggesting, like, the way that I talked about this idea, it felt like there was something there that they wanted to encourage me to explore. And, you know, I think I really didn't know how to approach where do I start with that. It's like, okay, well, I would like to try that, but where do I begin? So, you know, I cast a pretty wide net. I was reaching out to all kinds of people who work in the transportation industry. I was in touch with a lot of the folks that I had studied with in graduate school who do extensive research in Guatemala and spend a lot of time there. Nobody had a lot of direct contacts in the transportation industry, so I ended up, you know, looking on eBay and trying to do research, looking on Craigslist, like where are used buses sold and how does that whole process work? And I made a bunch of calls, sent a bunch of emails, and a lot of people referred me to this auction just outside of Pittsburgh and sort of said, oh, you know, that's a place, I know there's a lot of buses that go through there. They usually have 100, 150 every auction season. There's a couple auctions a year. And so, you know, as I was nearing the end of that first year, I felt like, okay, well, if I'm going to give this a shot, I should go visit this place. I should reach out to them and see if there's anyone that's there that's going to Guatemala and, you know, see if they might be open to the idea of having someone join them on a trip that would entail following the bus throughout its entire process of becoming a camioneta, which is essentially reflective of where the idea began to begin with. What ended up sort of inspiring the idea for the project was a conversation that I had about 6 years ago, shortly after I had finished graduate school and gone through this program where I had spent 2 years studying Guatemala, learning Quiche, which is one of the indigenous languages there, and I did not spend my summer during that time in Guatemala because I had chosen to basically petition the dean and the chair of the department to make a short documentary instead of writing a master's thesis. So a lot of the people in our linguistics track went to Guatemala to do like an immersive language program, and I instead ended up in a film school in Bolivia working on this short project that would become my project for that program. So by the time I had graduated, I had spent all this time learning about culture and society and history and its interrelationship with American foreign policy and all these things, but I hadn't been there. So I decided to take a trip I guess it would have been in January of 2009, shortly before I came to New York. And it was, ironically enough, it was by bus. And I went sort of through Central America over the course of about 6 weeks, kind of like backpacking, really. At the time, I wasn't, you know, I didn't really consider myself a filmmaker. I was about to move to New York to start film school. And the way that I got around while I was down there was on the camionetas, like everyone else does. And they struck me as interesting because they were obviously school buses, and they were obviously visually stunning in lots of ways. And as someone who had rode those buses growing up, I was curious to see that something I had always imagined was kind of like familiar and static and known had these other dimensions to its existence that I was unaware of until that time, for the most part. And so I started up a conversation with one of the drivers. We began talking about, you know, his life, his story, how he began working in the transportation industry. And it turns out that bus we were riding on came from a school district 10 miles away from Nashville, which is where I was living at the time. So it was like right in my backyard. And for whatever reason, it was kind of the last place I was expecting to hear. You know, you never sort of think like, oh, it'll never happen to me, kind of a thing. And then it was right there in Hendersonville, and we started having this conversation about, you know, his time living there. He had this shop with his uncle. They used to buy buses directly from the school system. They drive them down. They work on them when they get there, and then they put them to work so that their community can get to and from the city, or to and from. This was not in Guatemala City. This was out near the lake. But it was, you know, to serve as vehicles for public transportation. So it basically, I mean, I felt a lot of things during that conversation. I was really curious to learn more, and I felt personally connected to it. And I think what ended up happening over the course of time was that after I got back to Nashville, whenever I would see a school bus passing around, or driving through the streets or parked on the streets, it would be kind of a reminder of this encounter and this conversation that I had had, and also sort of an opportunity to share the experience with a friend or with someone else that was around. And so I think over the course of a year or two, the curiosity just started taking root in my imagination, and I realized how little I actually knew about the process, despite having had this sort of brief conversation with one driver. So that's where I began. It was sort of informed by a curiosity about the extent of the process, the people behind it, how the industry works, and how certain things I was interested in exploring could be sort of represented by the lives and the lives of the people who work in that industry and who become a part of this one particular bus's journey, which is obviously what the film became. But that's where it started, and it was really that little in terms of what was fixed or what was pre-visualized. I mean, it felt like approaching it as a film. It felt like there was kind of a built-in arc, right? Like one bus that sort of passes through time and things happen and people become a part of it. But I didn't know how this was going to work. And so I started doing a bunch of research, in part fueled by all this anxiety about like, what the heck am I getting into? And you know, and one of the first people that responded to a post I had sent out in the Guatemalan Scholars Network was a journalist named Cara Andrade, who lives and works in Guatemala for years. She's become a good friend of mine since then, and she basically reached out and said, look, like, this is a really cool idea, and I wish you well with it, but when you begin working on this, there are certain things you need to be aware of about the extent to which this industry is not just about bright colors and shiny buses. And I want you to, you know, and so she started sending links and information and video clips and all kinds of things. So this was after I had decided to attempt to make this film, but before we began riding down on the bus. So it was something that was on my mind while we were making it. How could I sort of fuse this concept of, you know, a film about one bus within the socio-political, socio-economic context of what's going on and the very serious issues facing a lot of the drivers. So that remained a question mark for a good part of the production, basically until the bus was sold. And once we realized where it was going, a lot of that became sort of specific and focused, and it felt like the way to properly channel that would be to see how it relates to this particular bus and take sort of a deeper look at in one instance rather than sort of trying to attempt to have like a more of a journalistic survey of the violence in general or to make some report about it, because I'm not qualified to do that, and that wasn't what the film was sort of intending to be about. So in order to maintain the spirit of the project, what I ended up doing was, you know, trying to channel that into what the fate of the journey of that bus sort of became along the way.
So I'm going to go somewhere else, and this is something that I actually was thinking while I was watching the film, and it's not the first time that I watched the film, so it's always nice because you see different things. And one of the things that I was thinking is, how much of the filmmaker is in the film? You don't see the filmmaker in the film. He's not in front of the camera. His voice is not there, but obviously his presence is there. And one of the things that I thought today is that this voice that doesn't necessarily correspond to any of the characters, and that has like I was just writing down some of the things that voice says, which is sharing the bus, being with friends, or even if they're not your friends, you're part of the same journey. And I was thinking, and forgive me, and this is just something that I'm putting into your film. It just felt like this is your relationship with the people that have been part of that bus. It's like your voice somehow in a journey, and it's just something that I thought. And you know, if you can speak a little bit more about these voice and why did you decide that these would be the guide?
Sure. Well, the voice is the voice of a guy named Luis Aguilar, who I met through Cara, actually at a bar at the end of a shoot day. And we arrived with all our gear, came up to the bar, started hanging out, and he was like, "What are you guys doing with all the gear? Like, what are you working on?" And as soon as we basically told him where we were at that point, which was pretty early on, that we had sort of ridden down on this bus and we were sort of following it through its process, he started coming up with all these sort of very philosophical, heady, abstract sort of explanations or readings of what he thought the project was exploring. And it was interesting. And so we stayed in touch, and, you know, he has an interesting perspective on it because he rides the bus to work pretty much every day. So he's a passenger. And once we realized, you know, I wasn't sure if that would ever become part of the film, especially given the violence that was going on board the route. Initially, when we began the project, I had intended to follow the bus in its new route once it began working and sort of serving the community, and you could sort of get more of a feeling of what it feels like to be on the bus once it's actually back and out on the road. Because it's, you know, that's something that you don't get. The way that the film is structured now, it's sort of about a bus in a liminal position between, you know, it's no longer a school bus, but it's not yet a camioneta. And so it's sort of framed by these bookmarks, and or these bookends, rather. And what happens in between is the process of sort of becoming. But initially, the idea was to also follow it in its new route and see if we could, you know, show some of that as well. Once we realized what was at stake if we were to do that and to bring a camera on board, that became clearly not something that would be in our safety, you know, in our interests with respect to safety, nor would it be responsible as filmmakers to bring a camera on board a bus and put our subjects at risk like that. Because what ended up happening, this isn't the film, but what ended up happening with the investigation that was done about the bombing that takes place during that night scene was that the people who were held responsible, who were determined to be responsible through the investigation, were actually from within Rutas Quetzal itself. So there was a lot of paranoia, and there were a lot of secret meetings being held by the collective in the weeks following the attack. And it felt like, you know, first of all, our responsibility was we should let them know we're making a film, and we should make sure, you know, Ermelindo talks to, you know, mentions it to the group, and to see if we could come and meet with them at all during some of these meetings. That didn't pan out. You know, attending the meetings didn't pan out. But what we chose to do was to try to be, you know, make the sort of responsible, respectful decision and not film at all on the bus after it sort of finished coming out of the workshop. So the way that we thought about how to structure the film, sort of to answer your question, changed as the film was being made. And it felt like Rafael, my co-producer, and I, who, you know, I worked with in the field sort of day in and day out, we're having conversations on a day-to-day basis, well, you know, most days, about ideas for what could be next and how this could all sort of congeal together into one cohesive film. And it felt like, when we realized what was going on, it felt like, well, maybe the end of the film could be when the bus pulls out. And we sort of weave all these elements as it's being sculpted. We sort of weave in some of the context, just in the way that a camioneta, has sort of a surface, but it's also composed of layers, and those layers imply history, and those layers imply relationships. Maybe the way to sort of present this world of this one bus is to sort of demonstrate some of that, and have the end just sort of be when it pulls out. So just as the sort of the structure of the film is about this like bus in a state of liminality, it felt as though the passenger, who is someone who is not quite at the place he left, nor at the destination he's going to, could sort of also lend, could also be a, you know, an element that could lend voice to some of that, because that's essentially what the film became. So we recorded, I mean, we talked for, you know, 2 hours, I think, twice, about all kinds of things, and we ended up using about, you know, maybe 2 or 3 minutes sort of as bookends to the film. But it was done through, you know, it was kind of, it just kind of became part of the project as we went.
So maybe we can open up for questions. If anyone wants to make questions, you can come to the front, and while people come to the front, I'm going to point at something that I think is crucial in the film, that is the use of music, and how these music sort of, you know, I think of these music as something that you would listen to in a road trip or something. It kind of pushes you forward, and it's something that it's, you know, it's repeated, and it has these sounds that are a little hypnotic that I think kind of like takes you forward in the film. So I don't know if you want to talk about what you were thinking in terms of music.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, the music, I mean, as you know, Todd worked with a composer, Todd Griffin, who did a fantastic job with the music. And at the outset, I didn't have any real direction as far as how I wanted the music to sound or where it would go or anything. I gave him a lot of freedom to work, basically, because I had I'd seen his previous work. I had a lot of confidence in his abilities. And so I didn't have much of a direct hand in the music. I mean, I had put temp music in there when we had a rough cut. That was the first thing to go, obviously, as soon as you hand it to a composer. But I mean, I agree. I think it does have a hypnotic sort of quality to it. And there are obviously, I mean, it is partially a road movie. So the sequence of driving through from the States, through Mexico, down to Guatemala, you know, there's definitely an upbeat part of that to sort of keep it moving. But I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that, because I didn't give directions about like, this is how I want it to sound. I sort of more reacted to what he was making, and we had conversations about where pieces could go, and you know, and things like that. But my role in that felt pretty responsive, and that could be in part because I didn't have a sense of what I was looking for. But fortunately, you know, I felt like I was in good hands that I could trust, and you know, we sort of took it from there.
So I don't know if anyone has a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can everybody hear me? One of the things that I think is so interesting about this film is that the school bus really is the main character. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that decision to have sort of a non-human as the main character of the film, or if that's correct.
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know that I mean, I think it was going to be, I feel like when I approached the idea initially, it felt like a way to uncover and come upon sort of situations in a way that would be sort of organic and also predictable in some sense, right? Like, I sort of began the project with a basic idea of a structure in mind, like, you know, and I feel like what the bus lends itself to is there's sort of a very grounded and visual sense of interconnection between this geographical expanse of land that we sort of call the U.S. and Mexico and Guatemala, at least today. And I felt like that sense of connection and relatedness was important, and that's why I felt like it was important to start here and ride the bus down rather than get on a plane and jump off and start looking for a story or something. You know, I felt like it was important to sort of to do that. And I think, I mean, perhaps sort of by extension, I don't know that I knew this at the time. This is kind of like something that perhaps, you know, comes in hindsight. But I feel like, yeah, I mean, it became a way to speak about a lot of different things, but you know, honestly, I don't know that I had like a set committed, you know, like, you know, dogma or firm conviction about like I'm going to make films about objects. I mean, honestly, like you know, but it felt like the best way to approach it and the best way for me to have a chance at sort of having a for even the film to be possible would be to try to begin at a place of relative familiarity or relative, you know, personal connection, and sort of let things go from there and kind of follow it. It just seemed like that would be more possible, and also lend itself to, you know, kind of a unique way of telling a story. Because I think, you know, it's interesting. You know, traveling around, you see T-shirts with, you know, schools on it or phrases in other languages, and they end up all over the place. And I think objects can speak about policies and about people and about, you know, things of which they are remnants, although they still have relations to those things. And it felt like embedding myself within a bus would allow me to uncover some of those things to which it was related in a way that could be visually interesting, and also lend itself to sort of a natural way of structuring a story.
Question. Congratulations, it's a great film. Just curious, well, two questions. One of them is, was there anything during the process of being in the editing room that you had to fight yourself on that didn't make it into the film, and maybe it would also have made it a different film? But was there any moments, any scenes that got cut out? And then the second question is, I'm curious about what's happened there since the film, and if there have been any other grenade attacks, and you know, since film was made.
Well, I agree with the first part of your question that if there had been other scenes in there, it would probably be a different film. So, I mean, there's nothing that I regret leaving out per se, but there are other things that I would have liked to include. That, you know, the first thing that comes to mind when this question comes up is the ride through Mexico, because it's presented in maybe 5-6 minutes. It's pretty much one continuous motion. It passes from daytime to nighttime to daytime. And, you know, in order to keep the story moving, and especially knowing that we're not going to be staying with this character throughout the entire experience of the film, there was a challenge with how is an audience going to emotionally sort of connect with this person and this bus and this film if it's going to be sort of starting and stopping and starting and stopping. And, you know, there was a lot more that happened on that trip down. Awesome things. It was really beautiful and touching to be a part of a community of people who do this work, and I felt really honored to be sort of allowed to have access to experience some of that. What I had wished could be included, you know, the thing that always comes up when this question gets asked is some of that community amongst other people going through that, and some of the incredible things that happen during that time. I mean, Mingo's been doing this work for about 8 years. He knows all the guys at all the hotels and the restaurants and the women, and you know, this is like half of his month is spent passing through this area. he also knows the places to avoid and the places to be careful. But, you know, I wanted to sort of show more of that sort of complexity of the ride through. And I think some of that got abridged just in service of the larger piece and in terms of, you know, reasons for editing and a lot of things. Because as a viewer, if you spend 15 minutes with Mingo on the road and sort of that becomes the film. And when you get to Guatemala, you're like, well, where's Mingo? I don't care about the bus. I don't, you know, it becomes a different film, as you said. So that would be probably my answer to the first question. The second part, there's a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of things that have changed. There's a lot of things that have stayed the same. I mean, the short answer is everyone is alive and well. The bus is still running. There have not been any grenade attacks since then. That was a relatively, I don't want to say an isolated incident, but it was a particularly heightened moment. There had not been, my understanding is there had not been a grenade on board a bus since years, you know, during the protest of some of the Civil War. It was a pretty extreme measure and was by no means the norm, which made it sort of all the more complicated for that to be going on within the route of the bus that we had followed. So it introduced a lot of complications when working and thinking about how we were going to approach the project. What happened immediately afterwards, that grenade attack was right after Christmas. It was in January 3rd of 2011. And what happened in the immediate aftermath was the FBI was called down to investigate. There was a huge investigation that went down. They detained someone who turned out to not be the perpetrator. It ended up sort of being a somewhat inside job. And the response was, in part, I think, because this was an election. This was like in the lead up to an election. And there was a pretty big change of power from the administration of Alvaro Colón to the current president. And he ran on this platform of this sort of mano dura, you know, we're going to stamp out organized crime. You can see the fist on the T-shirt of the driver when they're sort of having the coffee and eggs, which was kind of surprising for us to see, but common, you know. And so yeah, the immediate response from the state was to have sort of a show of force, to put armed guards, troops and cops out in the roads and on buses to sort of make people feel safer. And it was specifically in Rutas Quetzal, although some other routes also have armed guards on board sort of regularly. Not as often the ones that are privately owned and operated, but it sort of varies. I think depending on your experience and your interpretation of history and, you know, I don't know how many people would feel comfortable or safe with that, but that was the immediate response. Shortly afterwards, those guards were removed, and the violence died down quite a bit. So by the time we went back and screened the film publicly, you know, there had been a number of changes. That was, Rutas Quetzal was no longer sort of at the center of this issue. And it was sort of back to sort of normal. But I should say that normal does not mean that the problem is gone or resolved by any means. I heard from Mario Andres, I was talking to them about 2 weeks ago, and there were 2 other drivers in their route that had gotten their lives taken. So, I mean, the way that violence operates within the public transportation industry is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's been about 10 years sort of in the making, and it arrived to that particular sector because it's an extension of extortion. And the extortion continues, the violence happens when people do not pay up, and to this day, that's a difficult situation that a lot of drivers and ayudantes and owners find themselves in. The hardest parts of film? Do you mean like practically speaking or like emotionally or like with logistics? Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, everything was a process. I don't know that there was anything that was the most difficult. In some sense, the most difficult was getting what felt like more genuine access to our main characters. It wasn't the cops or the border or, you know, the scene with the body or some of the things that feel like there might have been more hard work behind that. That actually was it took some time, but it was within reach in a different kind of way because there was a sort of process that you go through that you could sort of figure out and understand and approach so I'm not totally sure how to answer that. Actually, I think the most difficult thing to get, probably, in terms of practical questions, was the sequence with the passengers on board. It's brief. It's right after the cops come on board and search the bus, and it's right before we return to the workshop. That was the most difficult thing to film because we were not going to be shooting on our bus. And we didn't, at the time, for half of those shots, we did not have any sort of security with us. But it felt like we need to show some of these buses with people somehow moving and doing their thing. So that was difficult. And, looking back on it in hindsight, it kind of feels stupid that we even brought a camera on board a bus to do that. I was working, as I mentioned before, I was working with a local filmmaker and was kind of trusting his judgment on a lot of these things. And the way that those images came about was we got on a bus, we had a small backpack, and we would sort of we would ride around for a while, we'd get a sense of the bus and the passengers first and sort of feel things out, and then pull out the camera and shoot a bit, and but what ended up happening one of those times was that there were a couple folks on board. They were kind of eyeing up the equipment. I think they probably spotted me as a target and obviously as a foreigner. And thankfully, Rafael noticed and, tapped me on the shoulder and he was like, Mark, bajamos ahorita, like, we got to get off, like, no questions asked. And he is a very calm and collected guy. And so he didn't say much, but the way he said it and the fact that he said it, I didn't need to know anymore. It was like, okay, yeah, we're off, cool, we're done, we got it. So we got off, and that actually ended up becoming part of how we had access to the police, because we referred to that challenge and, bad decision while we were meeting with them, trying to see if we could film sort of behind the scenes in the precinct where the bus passes through. So I think that was probably practically the most difficult, just because it was a little bit outside the nest that we had sort of been building within the world of the bus, and the people with whom we had been spending most of our time. So it felt a little bit outside of that, and I think that's probably where some of those challenges came into play, because it was less natural. Sure.
We're gonna take one more question, or we can take maybe two questions and then bring it back so that we can wrap. Yep.
So I'm curious about sort of the public life of the film, not like the later stages. How similar or different is this from your thesis? And then also, maybe if you can give a summary or a timeline of the different funding and assistance you got, and anything that might be helpful for a current student.
Sure.
I think maybe we can take another couple of questions and then we can just bring it and you can address a couple of things. Yep. Speak up. Speak up.
Okay. Okay. Let me make sure. The first one was about timeline and funding, and similar versus different about thesis versus now. Is that? Yeah.
What's been added? Did you go back?
Okay. Okay. I mean, it's hard to put a number on it. I would say this is probably 80%, 75% similar to what I showed at the thesis showcase, more or less. The ending was different. There are a couple scenes that were not in there that are there now. Excuse me. I didn't do the color correction or the sound mix. Some of the music was sort of temp. It was the original score, but it wasn't like locked in there. I think that screening was in September, and I think we finished by, I want to say, January. So there was another, what is that, 4 or 5 months of editing and post-production work, and we were, I was working that whole time. I think after showing it at SVA, I spent another 4 weeks with 2 different editors, sort of refining what we had. The composer continued doing work in response to that. And I did shoot a bit more after that screening. I went back to Spotsylvania twice and shot some footage on bus 217 that's currently in circulation, which is the 2 images at the closing of the film. You don't need to know that that's what it is, but it's Spotsylvania bus 217. And I didn't, it was something, I wasn't sure where the starting point of a story like this should be. Like, where does it start and where does it end? If it's about relationships, like, how do you determine that? Part of it feels like, as someone born and raised in this country, it sort of feels like I should approach the subject through something with which I have a pre-existing relationship and sort of explore it through that. But so I started, just chronologically in terms of production, like we were talking about earlier, I started shooting at the auction and then began from there. But I didn't, I was never certain about, would it also be interesting to shoot at the school and follow some of the kids? I mean, how much of life with the bus here should we show? I mean, granted, if I had began production doing that and finding a bus here in the States, in order to actually have the concept of the film sort of unfold properly, I'd have to wait for it to get sold. I'd have to follow that whole thing. I don't know that would be possible. So I did 2 trips back to Spotsylvania to shoot both footage of the school and kids getting on buses, and also spending some time with the driver in the route. I spent about 2 days doing that. So I think that was in the fall, like November. And the one other shoot that I did was I rented a school bus back home around Philly and brought down a bunch of sound equipment and recorded all different kinds of sounds. We went out to a parking lot and we went on the highway. We spent the whole day doing all kinds of, driving past, stopping, operating the wheel, the windshield wipers, the ignition, all kinds of bus sounds, just to create a library that we could deliver to the sound mixer. So there was that. With respect to funding, that's pretty much it. It was the editing and those shoots. With respect to the funding, I mean, I started with a small scholarship from the department, and I sold my desktop computer. So I had about $4,000 when I started, and I enlisted some free labor from a friend, which is super important. And with those first 6 weeks of production, made sort of a short sample reel, did a Kickstarter campaign that fall because we had to cut the sample reel for class. And I think shortly after that, I was applying to grants throughout that process, just sort of seeing if it might be possible to get some support or, and yeah, I think the Kickstarter campaign was that spring, like in February, we got some support. And with that first money, I was able to actually build a team of people that I could pay to like work on the film and help and become part of the project in a, that was not related to production. And so, yeah, that was like probably February or March, and then shortly after that came two grants. And, you know, we got some private donations as well, both from folks here and in Guatemala and from my alma mater and from some friends and family. So it was kind of like a hodgepodge Frankenstein, you know, little checking account that got totally wiped out. So yeah, that's kind of how that got pieced together. I don't know if I've missed anything, but that's sort of the timeline. With respect to festivals, my main entry point to sort of meeting some of the programmers was through IFP, which is an awesome organization here in New York. They support a lot of independent filmmakers. And actually this past week was Film Week, which is a thing they do every year. Well, every week I guess is Film Week for them, but every September there's a conference and people come from around the world and around the country, and you can meet. They have an event called Meet the Programmers, and it's kind of like speed dating. You usually have a work sample, and you know, you have a short period of time to sort of get to know the person and talk about your work, and you can meet some folks through there. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I don't know that that's the only way to do it or that it's necessary, but it certainly helps to meet the people behind some of those things, and it certainly helped our project a lot. So yeah, that's sort of how I began. I had met a few other of the, I guess, a few of the programmers from Sundance through, well, I guess through IFP as well. Yeah. Sure.
I think we have to wrap, right? So Mark, it was such a pleasure.
Likewise.
To watch the film with you, and thank you everyone for being here. And congratulations again.
Cool. Thanks.
Classwork in the first semester at school was nominated for a Student Academy Award, and he took that short film called Time Machine to festival after festival after festival and continued to do very well in all of his work and studies during his 2-year program with us. So when we talked about which films we thought we should bring and which students we thought we should bring back for this first festival, Mark was very was one of the very first names that all came to our heads. But we hope you're really going to enjoy not only this film, but a lot of the other films that we're going to be showing throughout the weekend. And we couldn't be more proud of our students and happy to share their work with the rest of the world. This film has gone to numerous festivals, and you'll learn more about it after the film. Mark is here, and we'll be doing a Q&A with one of our present students, Danielle.
2.5 years, which is amazing. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So I guess one of the interesting things about having Q&As with directors after the screenings is that you have access to the process, which is something that you never have access to while you see the film, because when you see a finished film, everything seems so seamless. The cuts, everything just kind of like flows as if it was the easiest thing. And I guess I'd like to start with, what was the first thing that you shot, and how much of the story and the whole thing that was happening in Guatemala City you knew about when you had the idea, when you first sort of approached this idea?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it started by making a trip to the auction, sort of as I was ending the year of my first, as I was nearing the end of my first year in the program. We were all asked to select a couple thesis ideas, and this was one idea that I had at the time.
Tori, and please stay and talk to him about this film and enjoy it. Turn off your cell phones, and don't forget, if you want to talk about the festival, to hashtag After School Special for Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, and come back to tonight's midnight screening of Beavis and Butthead Do America. Well, which is so much like this film. It's It's a perfect double feature. So sit back, enjoy La Camioneta, and then enjoy a wonderful conversation between two SVA alumni colleagues. Thanks.
So as Mauro said, I'm going to be your moderator for this evening, and I'm going to introduce Mark. Mark Kendall's directing credits include the Student Academy.
Welcome to After School Special. This is the first year that we're doing an alumni film and animation festival here at SVA. I am the chairman and founder of the social documentary department here at SVA, and I'm really proud and thrilled to have tonight one of our students from Group 1, the first year, our inaugural year, Mark Kendall, with his film La Camioneta. Mark was part of our very first class, and we're now 6 classes in the master's program in documentary. We started in 2009, and we have been extremely proud and happy tonight for Mark to represent the success of many, many of our students. And Mark was rather an unusual and hardworking individual from the moment that he started school. His very first film from his
Academy Award nominated short, The Time Machine, and La Camioneta, which resulted in Variety citing him as a name to watch. His work has screened at the National Gallery of Art, the Jean Siskel Film Center, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and film festivals such as South by Southwest, Los Angeles, and Havana Film Festival. He's a Guggenheim Sundance Institute and IFP Film Society of Lincoln Center Emerging Visions Fellow. He earned a BA in Anthropology and a MA in Latin American Studies from Vanderbilt University, and he is a graduate student of SVA MFA Social Documentary Program. He currently lives and works in Philadelphia. Please welcome Mark Kendall. Mark, I think part of what's interesting about Q&As, and you've done many by now because this film has been touring for